I had this life. I liked it. It had rules. I followed the rules, and that made everything right. And then you come along and you throw everything up. This strange human with arrogance, stubbornness.
Tom.
Let me finish. You saw the recording and you didn't say a word. You are like a plague, John Crichton, and you have ruined my life. And yet I just keep coming back.
If you're wondering why I included a scene from Farscape at the beginning of a video that's supposed to be on autism and love, trust me, I will be getting to that. But first, I would like to start out by saying that I rarely, if ever, see any representations of autistic love in media that I actually like or relate to. I won't say that they don't exist, because they definitely do, but in my opinion, they rarely feel authentic and genuine. Usually because they're written by allistic people. Allistic meaning not autistic. And they're usually written from an allistic perspective. It usually involves putting the allistic person in the relationship because it's almost always an allistic person and an autistic person, not two autistic people, or more than two autistic people, up on some kind of pedestal. The narrative wants to act like loving one of us is so brave and heroic, which is quite frankly bullshit, and I hate it. I haven't been able to watch most of shows like The Good Doctor and Atypical because it was just honestly too painful for me. But other autistic people who've put themselves through that experience have talked at length about how problematic the rep is and discussed some of the romance elements of those shows as well. That's not to say there aren't other autistic people who do actually enjoy those shows, because I know that there are, but I don't think they're in the majority. I do also want to mention very quickly before we get into this that obviously love isn't just romantic. I'm not going to just be talking about romantic love. A lot of autistic people are aromantic. I myself am on the aro spectrum, and your experiences with love in general can differ based on whether you're aro, arospec, or alloromantic, which is not aromantic in any way, regardless of whether you're autistic or not. You know, everyone's different. Also, not everyone experiences love. Loveless aros do exist. They are real and they are valid, and we are not going to demonize them. Now, let's get down to the nitty-gritty. The majority of my childhood, I was never really given a representation of how I felt love in a platonic, familial, or romantic sense, because I was a lesbian, because I was demi-romantic, but also because of my autism. And as I got older, I was introduced to sapphic relationships in media, and I was obviously happy to see those representations. I still didn't feel fulfilled. I always felt like there was something missing. Until, that is, I was introduced to a science fiction show called Farscape, a character called Aaron's son. Officer Aaron's son, Peacekeeper Commando, a carrying company, Plizar Regiment. For those of you who don't know what Farscape is, I think I'll just let the early season's bit sequence speak for me.
My name is John Crichton, an astronaut, a radiation wave hit, and I got shot through a wormhole. I'm lost in some distant part of the universe on a ship, a living ship, full of strange alien life forms. Help me.
And one of those strange alien life forms that ends up on Moya, the living ship, is Aaron's son. Now, she's a Sebacean, which is an alien life form that looks human, and a peacekeeper turned ex-peacekeeper. Peacekeepers in this show are basically the galaxy's cops. And I mean, they're technically military, but they go around policing everyone else and treating other aliens as lower life forms. Now, Aaron's arc is fascinating, and probably one of the best and most compellingly written parts of the show. I don't think I fully clocked exactly why she meant so much to me in the beginning, because I was just a kid. I just knew that I, intensely related to her, and the ways in which she dealt with, or let's face it, sometimes didn't deal with, her emotions. Aaron was one of those characters that probably, almost definitely, wasn't originally intended to be autistic, but I think she's very autistic coded. She's very loyal, and I would argue feels very deeply, but has a hard time showing it at first. She displays some signs of flat affect, is a huge stickler for the rules, and she doesn't like change. She also lacks empathy, and often seems like she doesn't understand or doesn't want to understand her shipmates' points of view, even if she does care and genuinely wants to show that she cares. A good example of this is in the stunning episode The Way We Were, when in Pilot's Den she centers her own feelings at first instead of just apologizing.
Have any idea how I felt when I saw it? When I was reminded of what I had done?
She's also ridiculously stubborn. She has a few instances of stimming, such as rubbing her fingers along the ridges in Moya's walls. Now, you could argue that a lot of this is due to her peacekeeper training. You know, she was trained not to be emotional, to shove down her feelings and be numb and cold. She was also raised to be obedient and be a loyal soldier and not question orders. And I don't actually think that matters in this case, because she still feels autistic based on how these things present themselves. And a conversation that I was recently having about autistic representation is that basically it doesn't really matter the writer's intentions beyond a certain point. If certain things are lining up in a certain way and they look and feel a certain way to the point where, like, you as a person of, like, a certain experience or of a certain marginalized community can point and say, hey, that's like me, I do that, then I think that still matters and should be acknowledged and validated. A good example of this is Anya from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. You know, there are the people who argue, well, she's a vengeance demon. Of course, she doesn't really seem to, like, get humanity or has, like, a hard time, like, interacting with other human beings and being quote-unquote nice or polite because she's so out of practice because she's been a demon for, like, hundreds of years. Which, yeah, sure, you could argue that, but also, like, the way she comes across as someone who's extremely blunt, often lacks empathy, often misses a lot of social cues, and has, like, a very, very, very good memory, and has, like, often very niche specific interests, like money and earning money. So she feels autistic to a lot of autistic people, and I think that's really, at the end of the day, that's really all that matters. It feels so seen and represented by Erin and characters like Erin. She also doesn't entirely lose the traits I mentioned as the show progresses. She doesn't become, like, a super warm and social person, always expressing her feelings. You could argue her arc is more accurate to overcoming trauma and dealing with PTSD than autism, but trauma also feels very autistic. Because unfortunately, we live in a world that isn't built for autistic people. We almost always end up with some kind of trauma. And a lot of us have PTSD as well. So there's a lot of, like, overlap in those experiences. Hannah Gatsby would say that is a Venn diagram with a lot of crossover. Comes across as someone who has been masking for her entire life, like me. She doesn't stim and open in obvious ways. If she has any sensory issues, she does a great job of hiding them, and she can socialize in a way that, for the most part, gets the job done, even if it's not particularly charismatic. It's definitely me vibes. But to me, specifically, the thing about Erin that feels the most autistic is her relationships, which is what this video is about. Specifically, her relationship with John. It's very much the running away from this man like the goddamn plague at times because you're too scared to be close to him because he's making you feel things that you've never felt before, and the strength of those feelings scares you. But you're also visibly jealous of him showing interest in other women, so you just end up being really mean because you were literally incapable of saying I love you. Like, maybe this is just my particular brand of autism, but ooh, that hit. That hit really, really hard. That hit me so hard. I felt so called out on, like, my 4th run through the show as an adult. In the early seasons, she is so dedicated to defending him and protecting his stupid risk-taking ass, but she will literally sprint in the opposite direction if he tries to talk to her about feelings. The whole thing just feels so autistic to me. Because we experience rejection so often in our early years, we get this message that it's dangerous to open our hearts to anyone, because we'll either be too intense or scare them away, or too weird and they just won't care about us the same way we care about them. We often get used and manipulated because we're bad at reading people, and holistic people will take advantage of that. Why? I don't know. Because they don't really see us as human? Because our lives are just something for them to play with? Maybe I'm being too harsh. Kids can be cruel, especially teenagers. But I just wish people weren't. I wish someone could tell me why so many people seem to get off on the suffering of others. I just literally don't get it. As a result of this, a lot of us shut down. I know that I did. And that's why it's so unfair when autistic people cast us in this role of the cold, unfeeling autistic person that doesn't need anyone. Because maybe we only act that way because we know we can't rely on you. Because we know we can't trust you enough to open up to you. Anyways, Aaron has this deep distrust of Jean pretty much all throughout the series, right up until the beginning of season 4, when he actually calls her out on it.
Aaron, I figure a relationship, the kind we're not having, is based on trust.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, me too. Because you don't trust me. So I don't know how to trust you.
And he's right. It's fair. I get why she has this tendency to keep him at arm's length, because she's scared. Despite her better judgment, despite her anxiety, they do get closer over time as the series goes on. John shows his loyalty to her consistently by being there for her, either in battle or emotionally. He constantly defends her, even to the other crew members of Moya when they're suspicious of her due to her being an ex-peacekeeper. He gives her space to just be. To be who she is and to be where she's at. Also, side note, I love this scene because as a neurodivergent person, I can tell you that floor time is essential. And he doesn't judge her for admitting that she misses certain aspects of being a peacekeeper, or that she feels lost and uncertain without a home or a purpose anymore. And I think it's incredibly telling that she trusts him enough to tell him all of this. John understands her feeling lost to a certain extent because he's also far from home. He is lost in space, however many miles from Earth, not knowing where the hell in the galaxy he actually is. So he offers her something that she's never had before, ever in her entire life. Understanding and acceptance for all that she is and all that she feels. And in turn, he's honest with her. The thing about this dynamic speaks so intimately to me. The feeling of being truly understood is something I have longed for honestly as long as I can remember. And in turn, she offers him her respect and her loyalty throughout everything. She is willing to follow him on whatever crazy scheme he's cooked up because she believes in him wholeheartedly. And that is her declaration of love. There's also the way they're so particularly tactile with each other. This isn't necessarily an autistic thing. In fact, most autistic people tend to be very sensitive to touch and don't like being touched. However, I can be very touch-seeking. I am just very particular about who with and exactly how it happens. And I think Erin might be the same way. With the way she's always stroking his hair, touching his face, etc. It brings very autistic touch-seeking behavior to me. Like, that's 100% how I am with touch. And it's not just a comfort thing, it's also a sensory thing. Her relationships with the other crew of Moya, particularly the OG crew, are also very interesting as well. He and Dargo start out being antagonistic towards each other. He hates peacekeepers, and for good reason, and she's suspicious of anyone who wasn't Sebastian due to her peacekeeper upbringing. But over time, they earn each other's respect through mutual appreciation for strength and loyalty. They work together for the good of the ship, and to keep them all alive and safe from the peacekeepers who are hunting them, saving each other's lives several times in the process. And that mutual respect grows into a bond. Like I said earlier, Erin is a very loyal person, and in turn respects loyalty in others. There's also the fact that a lot of autistic people are very actions-oriented over words, and we prefer to use our actions to show that we care about someone, rather than trying to find the words. I also find the relationship between Pilot and Erin particularly interesting from a neurodivergent perspective. They seem to have this unique bond and understanding of each other, partly because they've shared DNA, due to Erin being injected with Pilot's DNA against her will in the episode DNA Mad Scientist. And that gives Erin an understanding of how Pilot's senses and Moya's systems work that the others just don't have. And this information also gives her the skills that she uses to communicate with and understand Talon, Moya's offspring, when he's born. Tiberius Nero Blackthorn. Now, Ty is one of the only 2 autistic characters that are canon that I actually vibe with, personally. For those of you who are new to my channel, or perhaps just don't know, Ty is from the Dark Artifices series, which is a part of the Shadowhunter Chronicles. It's this series of books that are about these supernatural beings called Shadowhunters. that have angel blood and are supposed to protect mundanes, who are regular humans, and they're supposed to protect them from demons. And then there are these downworlders, who are essentially half mundane, half demon, or mixed with demon blood in some way, like vampires and werewolves. Ty's a shadow hunter, and he's fairly stereotypically written in the sense that, you know, he's a white guy, he's pretty nerdy, good detective skills, which I guess is partly from the fact that his special interest is Sherlock Holmes. The books, obviously. And he's read them a lot. But still, he likes animals, he knows a lot about them, likes researching them, and overall he's a brainy type. But one of the reasons that I really like Ty a lot more than other characters who may follow this pattern is that he just has so much heart and genuineness. That's not a real word, but whatever. You can tell that he cares so much about his family, and he has genuine bonds with them, especially his twin sister Livy. Another thing is that the writing doesn't seek to make him the butt of the joke, or make the joke wacky autism hijinks. He's pretty competent and capable in what he does as a shadow hunter and also as a budding detective. Side note, but it makes me laugh when certain people are like, oh, Ty is such a non-stereotypical autistic character. Like, really? Is he? A bit, sure, but not that much. I think certain people don't even realize how many things about their own autism is stereotypical. Like, I personally have never been an encyclopedia reading, fact memorizing autistic. I've never had a non-media based special interest, and I like loud music and fashion. Not once have I ever seen an autistic character like me. Well, but we'll talk about that later. And then there's the third, purely selfish thing. He's queer and has the same gender love interest. And that shit overtook me at age 17. I am not joking. I became obsessed. Like, if you were around me at that age when, like, the obsession hit, it was, like, right at the end of grade 12. Like, I apologize for the person that I became because it was all-consuming, and I just was not interested in anything other than those two at that moment. Like, I was on vacation in Europe, I went to Italy, and the entire time I was on my phone reading Kit and Ty fanfiction. It was ridiculous. And I am still obsessed in some ways. But before I talk about Kit and Ty and their dynamic, I need to talk about Ty and his twin sister Livy. And I have a lot of messy and complicated feelings about these two. For the longest time, I felt like I disliked Livy, and I couldn't really figure out why. And I hated myself for feeling this way, because far too often female characters are disliked or dismissed by the fandom for no reason. Mostly just because of misogyny and internalized misogyny. But as time has progressed and I've spent a lot more time with my thoughts and feelings surrounding her, I think a lot of it comes down to jealousy. At first I thought I disliked Livy because I disliked their relationship. The way Livy was always protecting him and explaining things to him, because I saw it as infantilizing. But what I was ignoring at the time was the fact that Ty often talked about how much he relied on that guidance from Livy and how much he appreciated it and felt like he needed it. And I didn't trust that at first because I remember thinking, well, I don't need this much guidance. I've never had anyone explaining these things to me in my childhood, and I was totally fine. I never had anyone holding my hand, not mocking me every step of the way for not knowing things, calmly explaining things to me in a way I understood, not berating everything I did at every turn, and I totally turned out fine, right? Totally fine. Spoiler alert. No, you didn't, Faye. No, you didn't. I have so much childhood trauma, it is ridiculous, and I'm now trying to reckon with all of that as an adult. And it's painful because A, I'm realizing how I was failed by certain people and how I deserved better from them. And B, I'm realizing all those times I told myself I was fine, all those times I told myself to just shake it up and suck it up, don't cry, don't be annoying, don't be a problem, don't cause a scene, just make yourself smaller and smaller and smaller every day. Shrink yourself down into a little box until one day someone asks you if you like Chinese food or not, and you have no idea how to answer that question because you've been carefully crafting your personality to be pleasing to everyone around you for as long as you can remember, so you as a person don't really exist anymore. So you just freeze up on the spot, desperately trying to figure out which answer is going to make them the most happy based on who you're talking to in that moment. And then everyone's looking at you like you're insane because they just asked you a simple question about food and you're taking like 5,000 years to answer it. So yeah, I have a lot of jealousy towards Ty for being raised in an environment where he was almost never forced to mask, and he was protected from those who would be ableist towards him to a certain extent. After his father was gone, basically no one was ever judging him or making little comments that they don't see as rude but actually are. You know, comments like, just eat it, it's not that big of a deal, or why'd you never ask me how my day is going? Like, if you want to tell me about your day, then why don't you just tell me? Why are we doing this whole song and dance where you're making me guess what you want from me and then being all passive-aggressive instead of actually just communicating to me directly? But okay. Like, I'm not a mind reader? Anyways, I have a tendency to be angry towards Ty for having things that I never had, and for not just flawlessly being able to handle things I, at the time, thought I could handle. And I spent an entire lifetime telling myself that I didn't need those things. And I think that also manifests as anger towards Livy because there's a part of me that just doesn't buy it. I've heard so many stories from autistic people who do have siblings that are autistic and have been incredibly difficult to deal with. And they also have a tendency to center themselves. So I always said that being an only child was a great gift. And a part of me still feels that way. But I do wonder, if I had a sibling like Livy, then maybe things would be different. And yeah, sure, I think she does have moments where she does overstep and cross boundaries at times, like telling Kit the whole story about Paige. I still think that should have been Ty's story to tell. But I think a part of why I feel so strongly about that is because I'm so sensitive about my personal information and secrets, and I hate people talking about me behind my back. Which is partly just a common experience, I think, but also very rooted in my own trauma. Because being autistic and being raised as a girl, I dealt with girls gossiping about me a lot growing up. And then there's the part I'm very reluctant to admit, but it's the truth. Autistic people are human beings, and human beings make mistakes. I'm not saying it excuses bigotry, but I'm saying being so punitive and Catholic in your belief system, like you must seek redemption through suffering for your sins, is not a productive way to induce change. I get it. I get being vengeful and wanting to punish people, because simply put, revenge feels good. Righteous anger feels good. That's why the revenge story in fiction is so common. And I think that's also why online mobs are so common, especially amongst marginalized people. Because when you've been hurt for so long for being a certain identity, people's ignorance and indifference can hurt just as much as outright aggression. And it should. But going after someone who just asked why ABA is a bad thing and swearing at them or suicide baiting them is not going to solve anything. I get not wanting to constantly do emotional labor and explain things you've already explained like 1,000 times, but sometimes someone has to. Sometimes the resources just aren't there, or they spread misinformation, which is very common with autism. I'm starting to look at Livy in a new light, as well as Kit. Which brings me to discussing the relationship between Kit and Ty. The way Kit so clearly not only loves Ty, but is obsessed with him, is my lifeblood. Because it was something I'd never seen before as a kid, and honestly still haven't seen really besides this. It's something autistic people are so often told is out of our reach. True, genuine romantic love. And disclaimer, obviously you don't need it to be worthy or complete. But when you want it, and the world is telling you that you need it because of amatonormativity, the set of societal assumptions that everyone prospers with an exclusive romantic relationship. It can be painful when you're told either subconsciously or directly that the stuff you see in movies and read about in fairy tales just isn't for people like you. So to see Kit so clearly enamored with Ty from day one, using words like beautiful, and comparing his smile to the sunrise over the water and his internal thoughts, it made me feel something that I had never really felt before. This feeling of acceptance and pride. And yeah, sure, now as an adult I can look back on this and be like, don't get your worth from autistic people calling you beautiful or falling in love with you, have some fucking self-respect. But I was a teenager and I had like -100 self-respect. And it's not just Kit. It's Ty and the way he is around Kit. Like the way he waited outside his door for him to come out, and the way he always wanted to be around him, and Kit in his activities, and calling him Watson. It's just also autistic. Autistic people often show how we feel more through actions or gestures rather than words, as I mentioned earlier. Ty giving Kit the witchlight and trusting him with his internal process regarding all the shit going down, those are huge gestures. Not to mention the overwhelming fact that Ty clearly just likes being in Kit's presence, which is huge. There aren't many people who I just genuinely like chilling around. Without getting into spoilers, I want to talk about how I actually do believe Kit genuinely respects Ty, which is unfortunately very uncommon in most autistic allistic pairings. Yes, he has fucked up and hurt Ty, and I've spoken about this multiple times. However, I think my feelings have changed slightly on this subject over time. I recognized that Kit was being triggered by what was going on and freaked out and handled the situation badly. Like, he's a teenager with pretty obvious PTSD. Like, something was bound to happen at a certain point. Like, he was bound to snap and say or do something that he was going to regret. Like, it was really just a matter of time, because that's pretty much how it is with trauma. You know, you're just pretty much like always a ticking time bomb, and something is eventually going to give, in my experience. And like, they both handled the situation badly, because of course they did. They're teenagers, traumatized and hurting teenagers. And I don't think that Kit said what he said out of genuine malice or disrespect for Ty. He was very much just reacting to his trauma, probably having an emotional flashback. But of course that doesn't make it okay. I, however, will never forgive the fandom's general reaction to these scenes in Queen of Air and Darkness, and I'm still mad at Cassandra Clare for presenting this whole thing from only Kit's POV, opening up the floodgates for ableism central online. There's this general common theme that I was seeing a lot in these discussions that was really making me upset and triggering me, and I felt like every time I tried to vocalize exactly what it was, either people would just misinterpret me, either willfully or just because I wasn't communicating properly, or like I just couldn't quite put my finger on it exactly. But essentially what I think it is like, so often, you know, society has so much empathy for the suffering allistic person or the suffering neurotypical person. Not saying Kit's neurotypical, but you get the idea. Like, their pain and their angst and their emotions are always prioritized and, you know, elevated, because that's what this society does, this ableist, biased society, you know. And from a very young age, autistic people are always taught that we have to prioritize your feelings above our own, because that's just what is done. That's just how the world works. We are taught from a young age that, and I've spoken about this before, that our feelings don't matter because they are selfish and wrong, essentially. Even if those exact words aren't being used, we get that through like subliminal messaging and like subconscious stuff. And we are trained like dogs, basically from children, how to interact with people to make you guys feel good, and to always make sure that we are like always considering your feelings, always considering how things will make you feel, always considering like being on time for you, and like prioritizing essentially you guys. Like, and yeah, sure, like considering your friends' feelings or like the person you're in a relationship with is an essential part of a relationship. But I was reading this book by brain is blanking on the right word, but this guy who has his PhD. I guess you could call him a doctor then. I'm not entirely sure how that works. I'm a dumb bitch, but his name is Devin Price. He's autistic, and he has written many books. I was reading this one book of his, basically on like unmasking autism, and I will put the quote in after I film this video because I'm not going to remember it off the top of my head. I got into unhealthy codependent relationships because I needed approval and I didn't know how to get it, so I just molded myself into whatever my partner at the time was looking for. Autistic people end up in abusive and toxic relationships. Like, literally every single autistic person I have ever talked to has been abused by a friend or a romantic partner, whether it's physically, sexually, or just emotionally. And when I say just emotionally, I'm not trying to say like it's less important, but a lot of society views it that way. So like, yeah, anyways. And like, the reason for that is because we're essentially primed for it, especially those of us who are like socialized as girls from a young age. We are taught to be self-sacrificing, and we are taught to put aside our own feelings in service of other people, and then autistic people are taught to do that like even more. So when you put those two things together, like an AFAB socialization, or it's not always strictly AFAB, because I know some trans women end up with this experience of socialization too as well, but like essentially, like for the most part, being socialized as a girl, like when you put that with autism, it makes a really, in my personal experience, like fucked up combination. It makes such a bad combination. It basically primes you to be a human doormat. Recently in like autistic spaces, this phrase, chronic people pleaser, came into focus. And yeah, that's essentially what it is. You become like a chronic people pleaser. It becomes like this switch in your brain that just flicks on and then it breaks and you can't turn it off. But what this has to do with Kitten Tai is like, so when you see like these people online reacting to this and being like, oh, poor Kit, poor Kit, poor Kit, and Kit's feelings, Kit's emotions, censoring all of that stuff and not taking into account any of what Tai was going through and what Tai was feeling. And then when you try to, in like posts on Tumblr or whatever, and everyone is like, yeah, but what about Kit? And what about what Kit was going through? What about Kit's feelings? It makes you pretty goddamn angry is what it makes you. And I just lost my shit a few times at people and said some things that I really regret during that time. But like, I hope now that I've explained all of this, you understand like where that was coming from. Like, it's coming generally from a place of trauma and a place of like constant oppression. We as autistic people are forced to live in a world where we are always forced to sympathize with you, but you never try and sympathize with us or understand what we're feeling or going through, because the world and society tells you that you don't have to. And there should not be a controversial statement. We're people too. Please treat us like it. The thing is, despite all of this, despite the shit show, you still have an entire 2 books worth of proof that Kit genuinely not only loves Tai, but respects him. From his handling of his meltdown to his concern over his sensory issues, and always being the one to explain something if Tai's confused. Not to mention the way he clearly has such respect for Tai's special interests, always letting him info dump and even taking an interest, and letting himself play a role in the Sherlock and Watson dynamic. The whole Kit and Tai thing is just so incredibly significant when you compare them to another allistic autistic couple in media. One that conveniently showcases exactly all of the reason I am never dating an allistic woman as long as I live. And it does it quite well. Winnie Gallagher-Jones. Let's talk about Heartbreak High. Heartbreak High is a Netflix show which is actually a reboot of an Australian show from the 90s, and the reboot is also Australian. It's about a group of teens in high school, obviously, who navigate sex, love, heartbreak, and typical teen show fashion. It's a lot like sex education, actually. And Quinny is one of those teenagers. First of all, I just want to say that I think Quinny is great rep in my opinion. She's so much of what I've always wanted in an autistic character, with the exception of the fact that she's so sweet. There's nothing wrong with that, but I am personally still waiting for my autistic female character or non-binary character who is kind of a bitch. I need that representation. Me and my fellow autistic bitches need our representation. And like someone who loves heavy metal and like alt rock. I also love the way the writers handled the situation with Sasha, showing how autistic people often say they're okay with having an autistic partner, and then you do autistic things and end up having symptoms of the checks notes disorder you said you had, and then suddenly it's not okay. Sasha is so infantilizing towards Quinny, often acting like her mother and trying to stop her from making her own decisions on things like doing drugs. And this isn't me being like pro-drugs, YouTube, don't freak out. But like, if all the other teenagers are doing it and like you're gonna be like, oh no, like she doesn't want any, like that's so infantilizing, like trying to make a decision for her like that. She invites herself along to Quinny's big event that she'd been planning for ages, not paying attention to how obviously uncomfortable Quinny is about this. Then she throws Quinny's whole schedule off and is very insensitive towards her when she's clearly dysregulated and overwhelmed. The entire time I was watching this, I just couldn't help but think back to Kit and Tai and how my boy Kit Harington would never pull this shit. Sasha just assumes that Quinny won't want to do certain things with her, like hanging out with her friends, and makes the choice not to invite her rather than actually asking her. She also doesn't value Quinny's time in general by not showing up to Darren's house, as her time with her own friends ran late. And yes, she did text Quinny to let her know she wasn't coming, but it's annoying to be waiting for someone to show up only to get a text being like, oh, by the way, I'm not coming, sorry, after you've already been waiting, and Quinny points this out.
We made plans, and ever since then, my entire night has been out of whack. sorry. Time got away from me at Missy's, and I know routine is important for you.
Oh my god, it is a shitty thing for anyone to be stood up.
And, like, I get it. I get being a disaster schedule-wise and time-wise and being late for things. Like, I also have ADHD, believe me, I understand. But, like, there's a difference between being like, my brain is fucking me up again, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to stand you up and disrespect you like this, versus, oh, I just couldn't be bothered. Like, just couldn't be asked to actually care. But the thing that really showcases why Sasha is such a bad partner and a bad ally is the scene on the bus in episode 6 when they're coming back from the convention. I already made a Tumblr post detailing most of my thoughts on this scene, which I will briefly paraphrase here. I do actually really value this scene because so often in media with autistic characters, they are always presented as in the wrong and are the ones who need to apologize. With this scene, we clearly see how Sasha's words affected Quinny, not just through her later meltdown, or eventually losing speech, but also through her hurt when Sasha basically mocked her special interest and then accused her of playing the autism card. I can't tell you how many times I've heard some version of that. People are always telling you to stop using autism as an excuse when you're literally just displaying a symptom of autism, and that's causing the thing that you don't like. What really hits home is when Quinny points out that it's stupid and unfair for Sasha to be acting like Quinny's disability is a burden on her, because Quinny is the actual disabled person who has to deal with it.
Sometimes it's just a lot for me, okay?
It's a lot for me too, Sasha. It's my whole life.
And hilariously enough, this actually relates back to what I was saying before, how we're always expected to prioritize autistic people's feelings, but they never try and care about ours. People who are family members or friends of disabled people so often want to make their disability about them, like think autism mommies, acting like our very existence is such a burden on them and they're such heroes for putting up with us or loving us. And I find this hilarious because however hard you think your life is, I guarantee you being actually disabled is like a million times harder, and we also have to deal with your bullshit on top of everything else. And the situation with Quinny and Sasha is just so typical, because nowadays, with an increasing awareness of autism, a lot of autistic people, especially girls, love to focus on the adorable and fun parts of autism, and many people will say things like, I want an autistic girlfriend or partner, because they like the idea of having someone who's fun and cutesy and quirky and happy stims and is adorably clueless, you know, someone that they can take care of. On a goddamn manic pixie dream girl, which is not what actual autistic people, girls and feminine presenting leading people are actually like the majority of the time. It's a stereotype. People don't want to deal with the messy, gross parts of autism, the so-called cringy parts of autism. You don't even want to think about people who are quote-unquote low functioning or have high support needs. Fascinatingly, this whole story arc is probably one of the best representations of autism and dating when you're autistic, to be honest, even if it isn't positive. Because a lot of our lives and a lot of our experiences aren't positive, and I think it should be okay to show that. Don't take issue with autism media being dark or depressing to a certain extent, because a lot of autistic life is dark and depressing. What I dislike is the way neurotypicals do it. I dislike the implication that it's our fault or our disability's fault, rather than the fault of society and other people being ableist. I relate more to autistic suffering than autistic joy because life has been kind of shitty for me, and I want to acknowledge that, but that also doesn't mean that autistic joy shouldn't be showcased. And I think we do need a lot more of that in media. Brings me to Darren. Darren is Quinny's best friend and has clearly been for a while. They have a very easygoing and effortless dynamic that comes from just knowing someone for forever. And closeness is evident, not just in their dynamic, but also in Quinny's reactions to Darren and the way she is around them. For example, she's comfortable with Darren touching her unless she's like super sensory overloaded, like in the scene in the bathroom in episode 2. She sticks to their side like glue constantly throughout the show. They're always like hanging off of each other, linking arms, etc. And she trusts them enough to be comforted by them after a meltdown. Sasha and Quinny are like a step-by-step of how not to love an autistic person. Then Darren and Quinny is like the antithesis to that relationship. Autistic love and friendship done right, which is great to see. So in conclusion, there's a fair amount of representation of autistic people loving and being loved in various ways. Some of it's good, some of it's bad. but I suppose that's relative, and depending on who you ask. And it's expanding, which is so great to see. I still have wishes for the future, though. Wishes of more canon autistic characters who are like me, characters I can relate to. I'm still praying desperately for a non-binary autistic lesbian to grace my screens, or to read a book about one. If you know of any, please let me know in the comments. Usually people who are used to seeing themselves in media and don't understand the significance of being robbed of that experience are often like, oh, if you want it so badly, then just write it yourself, completely ignoring the fact that marginalized people are often less likely to be accepted as showrunners and prominent screenwriters, or just writers in general. Not saying it's impossible, but it's harder. Society wants to platform the familiar, what they know and what they're used to. Just look at the way fanboys will lose their minds every time a black character is introduced to an adaptation of their favorite thing written by insert white man number 26 here. But that being said, I do have the urge to write my own representation, and I hope I can get published one day. There are own voices autistic stories that you should absolutely support, such as Helen Huang's books, but there still aren't nearly enough. In the meantime, value what we have, specifically what I've connected with. I value the autistic coded characters I see myself in, even if they're never actually called autistic. I take comfort in watching things like Farscape and seeing Aaron's son struggle with her emotions. I put the clip in from the green-eyed monster at the beginning of this video because I remember feeling so overwhelmingly moved by that scene as a kid. I still am every time I watch it, and now I know why. Because it rings true. And in the end, that is all I ask for. To see a character on screen or read about them in a book and be able to say, that's me.